Terrific. Thank you very much, and very happy to have you join us again for an ICDR Young and International Construction program that we will be doing. This is a continuing series that have been quite successful. We'll have the program today and some additional webinars later in the year. And if you missed it, we also had a 4-part series we did last year that was recorded and is available on the ICDR Young and International site, which can be accessed from our ICDR.org page under Education and Resources. I do invite you to join the ICDR Young and International, where you'll see announcements on our continuing events, all free of charge, and access to over 55 recorded programs that we currently have on that site. I do want to say that for international construction, it is an incredibly important focus area for the ICDR. Each year, it's one of our leading international caseloads. We continue to do programs, update our arbitrators, panels, and services. This year, for example, we're working on our updated dispute avoidance review board procedures, which you'll hear more about. In fact, we'll be doing a conference in Colombia on October 19th, focusing on those dispute avoidance review board procedures. So let me just say welcome to everyone. I do want to thank our speakers today for generously donating their time to be on this webinar. I also want to thank our cooperating entities, the Society of Construction Law, the ABA, American Bar Association's Forum on Construction Law, and the Young Construction Practitioners. So with that, let me turn it over to Clara, and thank you all again.
Thank you, Luis. So I'm Kira Ross. I'm a senior associate at Vincent & Elkins, and I'm really excited to introduce a panel with such diverse and extensive experience in the construction industry to discuss a really key topic for our junior practitioners. When considering construction disputes, we often discuss the triangle of quality, time, and costs, which typically form the bedrock of construction disputes. And today, we're going to discuss quality in the form of defect claims in construction projects and highlight some of the key issues to consider legally, practically, commercially, and from an expert perspective, as well as the legal basis for the claims in a few jurisdictions. So turning to our panel, we will shortly be hearing more on defect claims from Peter Land, Roberta Downey, Tiago Isfer, and John Baxter. Coming up first will be Peter Land, who's a barrister at Atkin Chambers, but originally qualified as an engineer. And he's used his 15 years of experience across a range of sectors to underpin his significant experience advising on construction, engineering, and infrastructure disputes. We'll also hear from Roberta Downey, who's a partner at Vincent & Elkins and head of our International Construction Group. She'll forgive me from quoting from Legal 500, Roberta is the queen of construction disputes, and I feel very lucky to be able to learn from her day to day. We also will hear from Tiago Isfer, who is a founding partner at Guandolini Isfer and Oliveira Franco Advocates, and I have the pleasure of working with Tiago as part of the Young ITA Committee, where he serves as the Brazil co-chair. He represents clients in the construction industry as well as various others. And finally, we'll hear from John Baxter, who is a professional engineer with 20 years of experience. He's also an expert in delay, quantum, and technical matters at HKA and remains a registered engineer in Alberta and Ontario. John has also been recognised by Who's Who Legal as a construction expert future leader. Now, without much further ado, to kick us off, I'll turn to Peter Land. So in the majority of jurisdictions, the law of the contract is king. And while many overarching practical issues can be seen across multiple projects, the way such issues are treated will vary depending on the type of law. Peter, can you talk us a bit through the English law approach to defects claims, particularly in relation to standard of care issues?
Sure, thank you, Kira, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning to the participants wherever you are in the world. What I want to do is spend a few minutes with the sort of the dry bit. Roberta will liven things up a bit, hopefully, afterwards, with explaining how a defect is framed, the concept of defect is framed contractually. I'm going to take an exclusively English common law perspective and I'm also going to focus on defects from the perspective of a contractor rather than a pure designer. So where you have an engineer or an architect contract, they tend to be restricted to skill and care obligation, not least because that's the insurance cover they can get. So I will focus on the contractor and building contracts, and I'll also take a contractual rather than a tortious focus for the same reason. So what is a defect? The broadest definition I could come up with was it's a breach of a contractual term that goes to the quality of the finished article. So what you can immediately see is that the answer to what is a defect is actually, well, it depends. And it's the age-old lawyer's answer of, well, it depends on the contract. It depends on the type of the contract, and it depends on the specific terms of that contract. And because of that, what you find is that often a defect dispute, in fact, turns on what are questions of contractual interpretation. So either very technical questions about what a bit of a technical specification in fact means, or broader questions as to whether some reference to a particular standard introduces absolute obligations to comply with that standard. So I'll come on to some of these concepts. But one of the most important considerations when you're looking at the terms of a building contract to understand if there might be a breach that goes to quality is the character of that obligation, and specifically whether it's an obligation just to exercise skill and care, or whether it is an absolute obligation. And by absolute obligation, what I mean is an obligation to achieve a result rather than just exercise skill and care in seeking to achieve that result. So where you have an absolute obligation, it is not a defense to say, well, I was very careful and skillful, and it was just unfortunate I got it wrong. And what I thought might be an informative way to begin to understand how these two concepts relate to the different types of quality obligation was to walk through some of the spectrum of types of contract, starting with the simplest building contract you can imagine, which is that you ask your local builder to put up a wall in your garden. And all you do is you agree how high the wall is going to be and how much you're going to pay him, and he goes to the builder's merchant and he gets on with it. Now, that is a contract under English law, and it has various terms implied. Some of them are implied by statute. So there is an obligation for that builder to carry out his services with reasonable care and skill. That essentially defines his workmanship obligation, care and skill. It's a care and skill obligation. There are then also two material-based obligations implied. There is an obligation of satisfactory quality. So the materials that are used have to be of satisfactory quality. And the materials, if the builder knows the purpose of the thing he is putting up, then the materials also have to be reasonably fit for that purpose. So even in the simplest case of contract, those are not obligations of skill and care. Those are absolute obligations in relation to the materials. If they are not satisfactory on a proper assessment, it doesn't matter how careful the builder was in choosing his materials. If they are not satisfactory or they are not fit for purpose, there will be liability. And material defects, there's a particular nuance in when it comes to materials and assessing whether there's been a breach. And that's the question of whether the material is inherently unsuitable, or whether, as a matter of generality, it is a suitable material, but there's been a bad batch out of the factory, which means there is something wrong with that particular example of the material. But in either case, under this simplest contract, that builder is going to have absolute liability for a defect in materials. There's then terms implied by the common law as well as statutes, where the purpose of the works is made known and the builder has professed expertise in that area of work, then if the client has relied on that builder's skill and judgment, then the works as completed, there generally will be an implied obligation that the works as completed will be fit for purpose. Now, again, that's quite a severe, for a contract that's just asking your local builder to put up a wall, that's quite a severe absolute obligation. Fitness for purpose is something of a buzzword, and it's something that contractors try to avoid wherever possible when they're negotiating contracts, because it is a results-based measure. It doesn't allow a defense of skill and care. And so what that does is it effectively elevates the whole of that builder's work to an absolute obligation. So whilst the workmanship obligation is skill and care, if what he builds with skill and care is not fit for purpose, it doesn't matter how skillful and how careful he has been. So that example, I hope, illustrates the distinction between these concepts of skill and care and absolute obligation, and also illustrates the main sorts of terms that are relevant to defect claims. So terms relating to materials, terms relating to workmanship, and terms relating to design. So this builder is deciding how wide, how thick to make the wall, and in that sense, he is undertaking a design as part of his general workmanship obligation. So moving up the level of means of procurement, the second sort of contract I was going to touch on is what's generally referred to as traditional procurement. That's where the work is designed and specified by the employer, and then a contractor is engaged to build what he's told to build, in effect, under some sort of standard form. Now, what you tend to get in these sorts of contracts is a very detailed material specification, and that provides an absolute obligation. So the builder is told what to use, and if he doesn't use it, he is in breach. Equally, there may be some materials that aren't specified, so the particular screws that are to be used, the particular fixings, then the contractor will also have an absolute obligation in terms of selecting those fixings. Workmanship in these sorts of contracts is generally specified to be care and skill, simply in the wording. And what that implies that it's the workmanship obligation that is used. So when a builder selects a particular screw, he is exercising his workmanship skill and care, but it becomes translated into this implied design responsibility. What is unlikely to happen in this sort of contract, as I described in the previous contract, was that it's unlikely that there will be implied obligation of fitness for purpose, for the very reason that the employer is not relying on the skill of the builder. They have their own architect or engineer, or both. So what you see in these contracts is actually less of an absolute obligation, other than in respect of materials. In the last minute or so then, I was going to move on to design and build contracts, and particularly contracts with a performance specification. These sorts of contracts have express design obligations within them, generally for the contractor to complete the design, because obviously there's some sort of design at tender. Those design obligations are frequently expressed in skill and care terms. So the contractor is to exercise the skill and care as an architect would be required in the same circumstances. So under a design and build, that express design obligation is one of skill and care. But what happens where you have a performance specification? So, for example, the building is to stand for 20 years without maintenance. A lot of what are otherwise skill and care obligations, in effect, become elevated to an absolute obligation, similar to the builder building the wall. It doesn't matter how careful they are in their design. If the contractor does not meet the stated performance requirement of 20 years service life, then there will be a breach. And having exercised skill and care in design is not going to be a defense to having failed to meet that performance requirement. And there's a particular example, Roberta may come on to it, of a wind farm case in the UK where the contractor exercised all the skill and care. It was told the specific standard it had to follow. It followed the standard. But it turned out there was an error in the standard. It had its design approved by the standards body, but then it subsequently turned out there was an error in the standard. And it was found liable because there was a 20-year design life, and the foundations of these wind turbines had started failing within the 20 years. So it didn't matter that it had followed the specified standard. It didn't matter that it exercised skill and care. It had failed to meet a performance obligation. So these sort of contracts really introduce a fourth element beyond design, workmanship, and materials, which are usually absolute obligations and therefore onerous on the contractor, and subject to technical evidence may be the easiest route to liability. I've overrun slightly, but I was going to pause there and let Kira introduce the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Peter. No, I think it's a lot of food for thought for a lot of us who think, oh, you can work through and build in as much risk allocation as you can in the contract, but that's not always going to save you from liability. So as much as we need to focus on the contract as king, you have to think about a lot of other elements when you're looking at these potential risks for defects as well. So thank you, Peter. Turning to Roberta, I know you've worked on a myriad of defects claim during your career. And of course, we're sort of slightly limited on time. I know you could speak for probably well over an hour on all the elements, but if you could help us perhaps with some of the more practical elements of a defect claim that you've worked through as a lawyer, and possibly with a case study, that would be very helpful for our junior practitioners.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Roberta.
Okay. Yes, in the time available, we'll see how many case studies I can go through. I prepared a lot more, but I'm going to start with this first one, and if I can get onto the MTH Højgaard, which is the case that Peter was referring to. So let's see if this works on the current slide. So this is a case, Floor and ZPMC. It went through the courts and is in public domain, which is why I can tell you about the name, the parties and some detail. First, the problem. The problem was it was an offshore wind farm. At the time, it was the largest offshore wind farm in construction in the world at the time. In January to May 2009, there was a subcontractor in Shanghai, ZPMC, who was manufacturing the monopiles and the transition pieces. They were a low-cost manufacturer. They were, and still are, ZPMC, they're responsible for 80% of the port cranes that you get around the world. So they are an experienced contractor in dealing with steel, and they had their own steel mill. What they hadn't ever done before was roll flat steel, right? And that's what you have to do if you're going to create a monopile and a transition piece. So they were a low-cost manufacturer doing new work, a new area for them. they had a contract for 8 shipments of monopiles and transition pieces. The first shipment, just before it went out from China, and unbeknown to the main contractor, which was Fluor, had cracks in it. The owner discovered a crack because they did, in secret, a spot check while it was still in Shanghai. When they were on site, they sort of wandered around. They did extra sensitive checking, and they found a crack in the weld. But they didn't tell the main contractor, Fluor, that they'd found one immediately. They told the main contractor when they found it after the shipment had left China about 2 weeks later, and there's various reasons why they did that. The second bit of knowledge, which the main contractor didn't know, is that the subcontractor knew that they had a quality problem, but hadn't told the main contractor. They knew they had cracks in the weld. So you've got the main contractor, the innocent party here, not knowing that there are cracks in the welds, but both the owner and the subby knowing. Now, the end of May, early June, so the first shipment leaves in April 2009, and at some point in May 2009, when it's on the high seas, they tell, the owner tells the main contractor that they think there's a crack in the weld, that they found one when they were testing in China. They couldn't say which monopile it was, they couldn't say exactly where or which weld it was, but they said they'd found a crack. The main contractor allowed them to test when it got to the Netherlands because they thought the problem would then go away. Right, first issue you have to think about is, should they have allowed them to check? Or is their inspection right only in Shanghai? Because it costs, and I can tell you, it costs a hell of a lot more to fix this problem in the Netherlands than it does in Shanghai. And that will be a question that you have to look at a contract. So there's a point to look at in the contract there from a drafting perspective. Would you allow the owner to inspect only in one location? And if it asks for another one, do you concede to it? And the answer will be, look at the contract. Don't deviate from it. Unless you've got good commercial reasons, but recognize there's a risk, because if they find something, what are you going to do then? You have to fix it, because once you know, you can't unknow what you know. Anyway, when it got to China, when the first shipment arrived in the Netherlands in early June 2009, the owner and the main contractor did do the testing in the Netherlands, and they found that these monopiles were riddled with defects. There were thousands of cracks in every weld, and nobody could tell you whether those cracks mattered, whether they compromised the structure, but the installation of the foundations was on the critical path, because if you've done any offshore wind, you know everything's offshore. The aim is to do as much as possible onshore so that you send them out offshore, but the cost of the vessels and the window you've got and the weather window you've got and the booking of your charter party is so sensitive that you can't afford to lose it. You can't. These vessels cost hundreds of thousands of pounds or dollars or whatever currency you like a day. So what happens is you have to use your vessels. They didn't know whether these ones would compromise the structural integrity of the monopile. So, but they knew it was on the critical path. They told the Chinese subcontractor ZPMC, and ZPMC said, no problem, we will fix it, but we want a change order for this because you're only finding them because you're looking with extra sensitive testing, and so we want a change order. So the situation you've got now is you've got a main contractor caught in the middle. The main contractor, being a responsible contractor, has to investigate. They can't just go ahead and install because they don't know the answer. The problem they have is that the terms are not back to back. I've given you there the main contract terms, which are some of the ones that Peter mentioned: good and prudent practice in accordance with all the reasonable standards and codes, and another one in accordance with the employer's requirements. And it says there that there will be a minimum design operational life of 25 years, right? That's what it's saying in the main contract. In the subcontract, you've got a different set of quality obligations. The ones that are important to look at here, again, you've got this fit and sufficient for the purpose for which they're intended, and it's free from defects. What happens by October 2009, they've spent 4 months trying to do an ECA to find out whether they will in fact compromise the structure. And they've had 100 Chinese and just about every NDT technician in Europe descending on this town or city in the Netherlands to try and fix it. There's 52 structures, because by this time 3 shipments have arrived with defects, because the 3 had gone out before the first lot had arrived and the problem been discovered in the Netherlands. But after 4 months, they've only fixed 6 of these 52, and they've spent $400 million. And their vessels are sitting with the crew sunbathing in the harbour in the Netherlands. So what happens? The main contractor in the end gave notice it would install. The main contractor got itself comfortable that they thought that they would probably be okay. The problem was the owner disagreed and expressed concerns and issued NCRs and said it was a breach of contract. The subcontractor said, well, I'm happy to carry on fixing them, but I'm going to charge you a change order and you're going to have to pay for it. So you've got your main contractor caught in the middle here. And this is an excellent example of where the best legal answer isn't necessarily the best commercial answer. And that's the point I would advise all young practitioners to bear in mind, that you must give clients options because they know things that you don't know, and the legal answer may not be the best one for their business. And the reason why is that most lawyers would say to you in this situation, go after the Chinese, right? Because they're the ones, there are undoubtedly defects in the monopiles. And if you remember from the clause I showed you earlier, there's a straight obligation that it must be free from defects. And the argument that, well, you're only finding the defects because you're looking very carefully is never a very attractive one to be arguing in front of any tribunal, I think, anywhere in the world. The reason they installed was because, first of all, they had another 5 shipments to come and they needed the Chinese still to deliver them. And also they were the main contractor was telling the owner up the line that we think that actually, despite the defect, the structure will not be compromised. And in any event, these are going to be out in the open ocean. So if anything did happen, nobody's going to die, right? It's going to fall over in the sea. There's a ring around this offshore wind farm, so nobody ought to be sailing nearby. And it's only if somebody happens to be doing maintenance on it at the time, which is unlikely, that you'll have a risk. So on the risk analysis, they thought it would probably stand up. And they had PhDs from all around the world looking at it, saying it would probably stand up. Now, given that that's what they were saying up the line, they couldn't then in the English court sue the Chinese, saying these were defective and it was terrible. And so it's an example of that is why they went ahead and installed. In the end, various years later, they found out that the actual load on the turbines was much less than the design, and so in fact they've so far, touched wood, still standing. There's not been an incident, and so actually they are structurally sound, even though they've got a defect in it. The next case study, and I'll just cover this one very quickly. I'm conscious of time. But it's the one that Peter was referring to, which is you have to comply with a specification and a code, but there's an error in it. And there's a difference. If you found the error during the design phase, as opposed to when you find it in the construction phase. I haven't got the time to go through the first one, but this is the case that Peter was talking about. It's MTH, Højgaard, and E.ON. And it's about the connection, again, offshore wind. And on the Greater Gabbard case, they had this as well. And so that was one of their defenses, that actually the grouted connection would kill these monopiles much faster than the cracks in the weld. But what you had here is you had various obligations as to quality spread across a whole series of contractual provisions in different parts of the contract. And you've got them there. And the concern here was between the monopile, which you can see in that drawing on the right, goes over the top of a transition piece, and the grouted connection was failing. And the effect of the error that Peter mentioned was it reduced the life of the grouted connection from 20 years to 18 months. right? So substantial. The person who made the error was DNV, the design standard. The person who did the design was Ramboll, who'd done it to the DNV standard. The first question again from a young lawyer, if you look at a purely theoretical one, is you may say go after DNV. But the first rule of law school is do not sue a man of straw. DNV doesn't carry much insurance, and Ramboll even less. So it wasn't going to cover the cost of this mistake. So that's one reason. The second point is that you'll actually find when you look at codes that they're very rarely prescriptive. They normally use words like guidelines and say that you've got to look at the particular area in question and see and apply it to your own case study. So you'll very rarely find that it's a guarantee or a warranty from a standard that if you do it according to their standards, it will in fact last. These were the facts. They'd published the 2004, they'd published their code. By 2009, the error was discovered. By that time, quite a lot of wind farms had already been designed and were under construction. In the end, this problem affected 13 wind farms in the North Sea, nearly 1,000 turbines. And to fix it, it was going to cost 26.25 million euros. And the question was, who should actually pay for it? And there was an industry workshop in May 2020. The first day of the workshop were all the owners, where they got together to see who they could sue and whether they could pin it on the contractors. And in most cases, they decided not. And the second day, they invited the contractors to come and help out, work out a remedial scheme. In April 2013, E.ON and MTH agreed a remedial scheme, but they agreed that they would fix it first and they'd argue about who paid it later, because remember, it was only going to last 18 months. I give you here the clauses. The most important point here is the bit in red. There were lots of different obligations. One was to do it in accordance with the requirements of the contract, which said you had to design and construct according to the relevant codes. But there was another one that it had to be fit for purpose. And the important point to take from there is it says that fitness for purpose is determined in accordance with the spec, i.e. the requirements, and good industry practice. So you then had to go to different parts of the contract to find the definition of fit for purpose and good industry practice. And you see that it says that you have to do it in accordance with the employer's requirements. That's what the purpose is. And if you go, that's in part C, you then have to look up the employer's requirements, and buried in part, it should be part I instead of part 1, the technical requirements, you have there various obligations, but the really key one is the one in red. And look at the word ensure. The design of the foundations shall ensure a lifetime of 20 years. And you've got a situation now where everybody knows it's only going to last 18 months at best. So you can't get wrong here. You know, if I normally at this stage, if we were all physically in a room, would ask you to vote who you think pays. Here's the answer. The first instance and the Supreme Court said it was the contractor, and the Court of Appeal said it was the owner. I haven't got time to go into the decisions, but I can tell you what all the engineers say, which is, oh my God, if that's the answer, you're asking engineers to warrant the code. The code's written by DNV. They're the specialists. They're the people that have done 20 years of modeling plus on this. And you're now asking me to warrant the code. And what Lord Neuberger in the Supreme Court said, oh no, I'm not. It's a trade-off. Whenever you do this kind of thing, you negotiate a trade-off. And they say that, you know, what you can do, and of course, Lord Neuberger has never written a contract. He's a very nice man, but he's never written a contract, and he's certainly never had to negotiate one, which is normally sort of 3 a.m. On Christmas Eve. What he said is you can agree to give a 20-year warranty if in return you get an exclusive remedy that your only obligation is to make good, and that they have to find it within a very short DLP, 2 years. And if you have that, then it's quite possible, and it's a balance. Of course, this was a very strange fact pattern that the problem had been found on an earlier wind farm before the DLP was up. but in most cases it would have been all right. But I can tell you, you show this case to any engineer and they'll go berserk that they have to warrant the code, but there is that risk. And because of the time, I will stop sharing and stop there, Kira, but I have got more slides if anyone wants them later.
Thank you very much, Roberta. That's a really useful insight into the practical applications of the law, and a very useful guide on how important it is to review all the provisions of the contract, particularly when you're acting as a junior, and really follow those definitions through. I think we have had a request for the slides, so we can send those around afterwards. Now turning to Tiago, your practice is based in Brazil, so there are obviously going to be legal differences compared to how English courts apply defects claims. So can you talk us a little bit through some of the substantive law that applies in Brazil? And also one of the things we've touched on here is local requirements and standards. So if you could touch a little bit on that as well, that would be great.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be alongside Peter, Roberta, John. I will talk about defects under Brazilian law. As explained, I'll divide it in two parts. The first bit of a standard of care in view of party autonomy and mandatory rules. And I'll also address an issue of jurisdiction regarding the early production of evidence. In this presentation, we have to keep in mind that I'm aiming at transnational arbitrations with construction sites in Brazil, foreign parties. So it's normally, we have sophisticated players, long and exhaustive contracts, oftentimes in heavily regulated sectors of the economy. So we have contracts. When we talk about the standard of care, these contracts, they have a table of risk allocations, they have service level agreements, and so this is the party autonomy where we have they actually decide everything, most things. It's never perfect nor complete, but they try to do so, and it gets a little bit easy because the main discussions are about the facts, not the responsibilities of each party. So when we have a defect of construction, we have to it's an engineering definition actually of if it's a project design problem, if it's a material quality, soil instability. There are many questions, we have visible defects and hidden defects. Sometimes the hidden defect appears 3 years later, and we actually don't know why. It could be imperfect execution of the contract, the construction, or it could be an inadequate maintenance. So it is actually a question of engineering. When we talk about the legal standard of care, first of all, we have in an international contract, we must pay attention that we have the choice of law. So if you choose Brazilian law, it's one thing. If you choose the foreign law, it's another thing. And in Brazil, we do accept the choice of law. It's in Brazilian Arbitration Act, Article 2, and we can even choose only principles of law or lex mercatoria if it's the case. But if we have the choice of law, we have also a limitation to the choice. It's public policy, and whenever the foreign law it goes against Brazilian public policy, that law is set aside, and or the public policy exception also works to deny recognition or enforcement of arbitral awards. the party autonomy limited by public policy also applies to the standard of care in internal law, in domestic cases, because we have mandatory rules. These, when you build in Brazil, you must obey. There are technical rules, there are policies that they will be applicable, whatever the contractual law might be. So first of all, to build in Brazil, you need a building permit. You need a local engineer and a local construction company enrolled to oversee the constructions. We have technical rules from ABNT. That's our Brazilian Association for Technical Rules. I can't go into any of them, but they set rules for maintenance, for the height of windows, for safety measures, many things. And we have a generic rule for warranty, 5 years of warranty, Article 618 of our Civil Code. Any construction, the contractor must warranty the solidity and the safety of the work during 5 years. And we have sectoral regulations. If we're building roads, railroads, energy, infrastructures, aviation, ports, whatever, we have many rules from agencies and from ministries, and if it's a public project, they will have many questions in the public procurement procedure. And and we have one thing here is that in Article 615, the contractor, he must obey. To summarize, he must obey the contract, that's party autonomies. He must obey the technical rules. He must know them and must obey them. If the technical rule prohibits the conclusion of the construction, he must tell the owner that they need a change. They need to change the project. So, and the cost of it will go to whoever was responsible, of course, for the project. There is a tendency to allocate all risks to the contractor in these complex projects, in engineering, procurement, and construction contracts, EPCs, turnkey, lump sum. We had mainly in public procurement, we had many problems of construction, unfinished construction sites, because we had to the justice. We went to justice to see who was wrong. So the government and private parties are trying. They tend to allocate all risks to the contractor whenever possible. And the article, I was talking about Article 615. So he must follow contract, technical rules, the plans and projects. These, of course, projects are part party autonomy and part mandatory rules. So we have to combine them both to approve a project. And the contractor must also follow the owner's instructions whenever possible. Of course, if it does impact the contract and the financial aspect of the contract, there will be compensation for it, but he must follow. That's mainly the standard of care we can legally have here. Regarding to the procedure of early production of evidence, it's interesting to talk with people outside of Brazil, because in Brazil, since 2015, we have a material right to produce evidence, even if we don't have the main litigation filed. So, when we talk about construction conflicts, 95% of the time, it is a problem of evidence. If you solve the evidence, you solve the case. So it is interesting because there is a recent decision from our Superior Court of Justice. They are responsible for the interpretation of our laws, except constitutional law. And they decided on March 14th, 2023, that if there is an arbitration clause, parties may not go to the judicial system to seek an early production of evidence. We may seek only when there is urgency. If there's urgency, you have the jurisdiction, the provisory jurisdiction, based on the right of access to justice. When you don't have enough time to constitute a tribunal or an arbitral tribunal. If you have the time, you have to do at the elected jurisdiction. And I tried to be as fast as I could. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiago. I think that one of the points you raised there really highlighted that importance of commerciality that Roberta was discussing earlier, with projects being halted because of public procurement issues and slowing things down, versus that commercial approach of fix it now and we'll fix the legal later, which I think is what most of our clients would like to hear. And I hope everyone will forgive us for going a little bit over time. We started a bit late today. And I know we would all very much like to hear from John from an expert perspective. So John, I'm sure you've seen these issues come up in real time in projects you've worked on time and time again, including the practical approaches to remedying defects. But just reflecting on your position as an expert, can you give us some insight into your approach to defect claims, looking at common points of tension in monitoring and identifying them, and also maybe the interrelation between defect claims and other claims in the projects that you might look at?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to talk today. I want to start off by kind of saying that in the past, I've worked with lots of different experts on mandates, especially mandates involving defect claims. My specialty generally is scheduling and economic damages, and a lot of the defect claims will require a subject matter expert, design construction expert, to look at the standard of care issues. So I'm just going to go through this with the lens of a scheduling and delay damages person, also integrating some of the standard of care information that's also required for these kinds of conflicts or claims. I want to start off by just saying some of the documents that we rely on when we're looking at these claims, and then I'll go into some of the timeframes in which a defect is discovered and how that changes the interaction between the experts and also the types of claims that can come out of that. With respect to the documents, of course, there's the contract, as it was mentioned before. Contract is king or queen, specifications, drawings. Also, during the course of the project, there's also non-conformance reports, which are key pieces of information to understand what are the kind of issues that were with respect to quality that occurred on the project. Consultant inspection reports. These are also reports that can indicate quality issues on the project as the project is happening, and what kind of remedies are being sought after by the project team and stakeholders in fixing these issues as they arise. Another key issue is the quality control procedures that are followed or should be followed, and the other quality control documentation that results from those procedures. Then there's the minutes of meetings, schedules. Another key aspect when dealing with delay is the daily, weekly, monthly construction reports. This actually gives us some insight into what actually happened on the job, even if the schedules aren't up to snuff, and it potentially can lead to other pieces of information that can indicate what caused certain defects, understanding what's happened based off of the boots on the ground writing the information. Cost information is key as well when understanding how much did the defect actually impact the project based on cost. So when projects find that there's a defect, coding costs to specific issues also helps in analyzing and segregating the costs so that the costs aren't muddied with potentially other deficient work on the project or other issues that slowed the project down or productivity. And then some other project-related documents include RFIs, or requests for information. This is information that the contractors requesting. They're not understanding what's happening with the design, or there's conflicts on the job. These are also indications of potential defects that might occur, might impact the project. And then supplemental instructions issued by the consultant, the owner's consultant or designer to the contractor, subcontractor. These would also provide an indication of what's happening with the design and if there's changes required, potentially because of defects as well. I wanted to talk about when defects are discovered. Roberta and Peter, I think, touched on this as well in some of the case studies and the topics that they brought up. But I'm just going to, from my perspective, where I come from with that, and some examples that I've seen and heard of, there's 5 periods that I've broken it down to. The first period is so after the bid is complete and the contract's been awarded and prior to construction. And when a defect is discovered at this point, it tends to be a design defect because nothing's been constructed yet, or maybe the long lead items, equipment hasn't been tested yet. But in these situations, it's generally a design deficiency. And so the type of experts that get involved in these types of claims, when potentially a contractor might have claimed that their designer in a design build type contract didn't design the project fully, and there's additional costs that they now have to incur that they can't pass on to the owner. In this situation, you need a standard of care to look at the design aspects of the claim. You'd also need a potential delay expert to understand if any of those changes that are now being implemented by the change in design, are they going to impact the schedule? How are they going to impact the schedule? And then you'd also need a quantum expert to kind of put all that together and understand, one, the increase in potential quantity or cost associated with the changes. And so that's kind of, in a nutshell, what would happen, the defect in design was found prior to construction starting, in one example. Another period, the next period would be prior to construction, but during, say, factory acceptance testing. So when long lead items or very complicated pieces of equipment are sourced early in the project and prior to them being shipped out to the project, a lot of times they're tested at the factory. And this might have helped in that the foundation mandate too, if this occurred. But they're tested at the factory, and one example is turbines. It's a long lead item, and there is extensive testing that has to be undertaken before that unit is shipped to site. And there are potential design defects that could occur with respect to what the manufacturer designed versus what is being designed and constructed on site to accept it. And the performance of that particular unit could have been affected. And if those defects impact the delivery time of that unit, it would impact subsequent activities on site. So there would be a requirement, again, for delay experts. There would be a requirement for standard of care, reviewing the designs and how the designs worked with each other. So the shop drawing designs made by the manufacturer and the consultant designs produced by the owner. And so that's one example of just the factory acceptance testing defect occurring. The next period, and this is where a lot of the defects, not a majority, but a lot of defects are discovered, which is after the installation or the completion of a component of the work. So this would be during the construction, placement of concrete, and it's found that the concrete itself that was placed was defective. I somewhat lived through this myself, where the concrete was shipped to a particular site. It was found later that the concrete didn't achieve its required strength, and it was due to the incorrect amount of additive provided to the concrete at when it was mixed at the concrete plant. And it so happened that that happened to about 10 different sites over the course of a day. And so all of those sites had different claims against the concrete supplier. And it turned out that there was no need necessarily for the standard of care, because they realized themselves what happened. It was more of a issue with what would be the cost, the reasonable cost to replace and repair the concrete, so remove the old concrete and put in new concrete, and what was the schedule impacts for some of the larger projects where it was a integral part of the structure, concrete structure. So the columns and slabs were poured, and now they had to remove all of that, and that impacted the construction of various projects. And so in those situations, there was a lot of reliance on the delay expert at that point, and then the quantification of the damages. And it was all because of this one incident that affected multiple jobs around a particular city. Another example of this is flange connections on a module, where the flange connections between pipes on a module were found to have improper seating or bearing, and it was due to the way that they were ground. And so there should have been QC records indicating that all the flanges were tested and that they were inspected, but a lot of this QC information wasn't completed or didn't match what was actually on site. And all of these modules got shipped from the mod yard to the actual construction site where it was discovered. And there was an extensive amount of costs required to rectify those issues on site. And there was a significant delay to the project as well. And so in that situation, it involved a standard of care expert to understand what the standard of care should have been with respect to quality control and delay and damages as well. Matter of time, I have one more example in this section, and then I'll move on. Another one that occurred was the construction of a hospital. There were windows that were installed in the building envelope, and hospitals are very sensitive to moisture getting into the walls and causing mold. And so there was testing of the windows as soon as they were installed so that the contractor could continue on with the interior finishes, because they wouldn't do that unless they wouldn't close in exterior walls unless the windows were watertight. And it was found that the windows themselves were leaking, and or the installation of the windows caused them to leak. And this was a significant delay on a particular project, which involved, again, standard of care of the installation of the windows. Was it the proper windows specified? How did that impact the schedule? Was it truly on the critical path? And also the overall cost incurred in rectifying the defect. The next period would be during the commissioning. And the reason I separated this from the actual construction period was during the commissioning, everything's generally done and you're doing a performance test on the systems. Does it do what it was specified to do? And during this time frame, there's lots of potential for defects to be found. And one of the differences is it's not necessarily going to impact other activities that would happen afterward, because at the commissioning, after commissioning, generally the project is complete. And so during this time frame, the delay to the project doesn't necessarily need a delay expert because it's delayed until the commissioning is complete, but it actually needs more of a subject matter expert to understand what are the issues, what caused the defect that is holding up production or preventing the system from achieving the specifications that are required. Quick example of this is during the commissioning of a system, hydraulic pump failed and released hydraulic fluid into a gas refining system and damaged, potentially destroyed the downstream systems that refine the gas. And all of these systems had to be disassembled, replaced, new components put in to clean out all of the hydraulic fluid. And this obviously cost money and it delayed the project. So there's potential for other liquidated damages from the owner. And so situations like that, again, defect in the pump was discovered during commissioning. And we found that those issues didn't necessarily require a delay expert to understand how they were impacted the completion of the project. And last but not least is after the project is done, the work is all complete. It could be multiple years later, over 10 years, over 15 years. So there's no delay expert required. There's definitely subject matter expert required to understand what caused the issue, what caused the defect. And then a quantum expert to understand what the cost of the remedy is. And the example of this is from a colleague of mine. They have a residential type structure. A foundation was constructed 10 to 15 years ago, and it started settling. And that settlement caused the actual home to shift on its foundation. And that settlement, when it was investigated, the actual construction drawings didn't resemble what was constructed. So at that point, the individual, who do you go after? Because the contractor doesn't exist anymore. There's an insurance company for the home. The developer potentially might exist, but are they liable for it? And depending on, I'm wading into the legal side of it, but depending on the timeline and the statute of limitations for the area. And so it turned out that the contractor at the time constructed the footing about 10 feet too short and not into suitable material, which most likely caused the settlement in the building. And now this is a potential cause for a claim under dispute that's currently underway. Trying to keep it short and sweet, but that's kind of my experience with defect claims in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was a really helpful overview of just how broad defect claims can be, and also that really key interrelation that we see so often between quality, time and costs, as we kind of discussed at the beginning, and also really useful information at the beginning of your talk on the kind of documents that are useful for you, which I'm sure for junior practitioners will be very useful when preparing scope of works for experts and thinking about things like document production. So thank you very much. And thank you to Roberta, Peter and Tiago as well for all of your insights. I'm sure I can speak for all of our viewers when I say this was a really illuminating discussion, and we really appreciate all of the time that you've given to us today. Thank you also to Zach Torres-Fowler for his tireless work bringing this series together, and the ICDR for agreeing to host the programs. As was sort of briefly mentioned at the beginning, there should be another one next month and another 2 before the end of the year. The recording for this will be on our YouTube channel very soon. So look out for that, and please do send it on to your colleagues if anyone was unable to attend today. So thank you all for joining, and thank you again to Roberta, Peter, John, and Tiago.
Thank you, Chair.